Welcome to Your Family's Health, the program that focuses on healthcare issues with unique and different modalities for taking charge of your health today. Experts talk weekly with our continuing roster of guests from around the country and right here in Nassau County to keep you up to date on the latest health issues and trends. Take care of your mind, body, and soul. Spend the next half hour with the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC, and get on the journey to better health.
Hello and welcome to Your Family's Health. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the nursing department here at Nassau Community College, along with Nassau Community College student Gina Peter. And today we're going to learn about something you probably never ever knew was possible. A process called embryo adoption.
Our guest today is Nate Birt, author of Frozen But Not Forgotten, an adopted dad's step-by-step guide to embryo adoption, who is someone that has adopted an embryo and successfully now has a child as a result of it.
Nate, welcome to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. Welcome.
Dr. Jeanine, Gina, thank you so much for having me today. Looking forward to visiting with you.
So first of all, I hope you're doing well in light of the COVID pandemic. Has the virus affected you personally?
You know, our family, thankfully, has been blessed. We haven't had any extreme sickness. We have had some family members fall ill. We did, unfortunately, lose a longtime family friend late last year. So that was a great loss for that family. But, I think there's no family in America that hasn't been touched by this. But thankfully, I think we're doing just about as well as we possibly could be and recognize there are many people in worse off shape than we are. Thank you for asking. I hope you and yours are well, too.
Thank you so much for asking. Everyone's well on my end as well.
Same here. Great. And I'm sorry for your loss. So tell us, for someone who has never heard of this idea, what is embryo adoption?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Gina. So embryo adoption, very briefly, is something that happens when families that have gone through the process of in vitro fertilization have remaining embryos. So oftentimes a couple that is experiencing infertility and decides to pursue IVF will go into the clinic, and over a period of time, those embryos are harvested. And oftentimes what happens is that more embryos are created than the couple is able, whether for health reasons or financial reasons, or simply because they've completed their family, they have these remaining embryos. And so they really are faced with several options. One of those options is to discard the remaining embryos. One of them is to place them in storage so that they can be, pay a retainer fee and keep those embryos there until they decide what to do. So they're in frozen storage. Another option is to donate the embryos to research. And then a fourth option, which is what my wife and I ended up learning about and pursuing, is embryo adoption. And so the couple from whom we were able to adopt embryos had been through IVF and had done what I mentioned earlier, which is to place these embryos in storage. And after several years of really praying about it, thinking about it, et cetera, recognizing that your audience probably has many different backgrounds, they made the decision that embryo adoption was the best decision for their family. And so they made the decision, thankfully for us, to place those with adoption for us.
So in the situation for embryo adoption, where are the embryos? How are they stored? And what is the process for adopting an embryo?
Yeah, thank you for the question, Dr. Jeanine. So really, the frozen embryos are kept in storage typically at a fertility clinic where the couple has undergone IVF treatments. And so there are these incredibly small vials or tubes where the embryos are kept. In the case of our daughter, she was actually in frozen storage for nearly a decade. There have been cases in which embryos have been successfully frozen and then brought to term after more than 2 decades. So the science behind it is really quite incredible. And so really what the process involves, in our case, we went through an adoption agency, and the agency really helped us sort of navigate the process like someone would for a domestic adoption or an international adoption. Really getting to understand our family's priorities and needs, understanding my wife's health situation, really giving us an understanding of the family from whom we were adopting. And they actually helped us match us with a family that had embryos. As you can imagine, estimates suggest there are something like 1 million frozen embryos in storage in the United States alone. That doesn't include any IVF treatments and frozen storage around the world. And so there are many couples who are going through this sort of decision-making process, and it's frankly very challenging. My wife and I didn't personally experience infertility. We have 3 biological sons, and our daughter Phoebe, who came to us through embryo adoption, was from the family that her biological family had been through the process and had experienced infertility. So it's a very difficult decision-making process. But once those embryos are successfully placed with a family like ours, what happens next is that those embryos are thawed. And then embryos that are viable after the thawing process are transferred to the adopting mother's uterus. And then, as with any sort of, normal conception or the standard conception process, then it's just a matter of time to take a pregnancy test and determine whether that embryo has successfully implanted.
Is there age criteria for this?
That's a great question. It really depends on the adoption agency that you're working with and also the advice of your doctor. So I strongly encourage folks who are interested in considering embryo adoption to really spend time with their doctor to understand the adoption agencies that exist. In my family's case, we chose an organization called Nightlife Christian Adoptions, but there are many organizations that offer embryo adoption services. And so in my wife's case, we were in our early 30s. I believe our particular organization, recommends embryo adoption for women under the age of perhaps 40, maybe slightly older than that. And really, it's a matter of simply the typical aging process of the body. As you get older, there are higher risk factors for carrying a baby to term successfully. And so again, talk with your doctor, talk with your individual adoption agency. But that was sort of the standard range that we were working within.
What does it take to qualify to be able to adopt an embryo? So
thanks for the question, Gina. I mean, again, it really depends on the agency you're working with and your doctor's recommendations. In our case, we needed to go through sort of a process as you would for other kinds of adoption. So we had a caseworker come out, interview us, interview our children. My wife and I both went through medical screenings to make sure that we were able to, physically, especially in my wife's case, carry a baby to term. We went through some conversations around our family finances. So there is certainly a financial cost, but there's also, your family needs to be prepared for parenting as you would with any child, right? So there's that process as well. And then from there, for my family's background, our faith is Christian. And so lots of prayer and conversation and thinking about, was this the right decision for our family? So, in short order, there is a spiritual component for those who are people of faith. There is a financial component. There's a health component. And then, of course, there's obviously, legal paperwork and things like that also need to be filled out that put the adopting family and the placing family, or in other words, the biological family that has embryos to place for adoption, paperwork that makes sure you're on the same page about how those embryos will be treated, the openness of the adoption, the relative openness of the adoption, right? How often are you going to communicate with that biological family, share photos, share updates, things of that nature. So it's a rather comprehensive process. I would say that in general, embryo adoption in some respects is less complex than a domestic adoption or even an international adoption, just because of the nature of the process.
How old is this idea of embryo adoption? Has this always been around?
Yeah, it's a relatively, in the grand scheme of time, it's relatively new. If a memory serves, the first successful embryo adoption happened around 1989, 1990. And that first embryo adoption really created a pathway for the formation of embryo, agencies that offer this as a service. And so it's really been something that's happened within the last, 30 to 35 years. And it's grown since then. I wouldn't say it's a large, exponentially growing segment of the adoption world, but it's certainly something that's for families that qualify and that feel that it's sensible for them. It's certainly something that's been a great blessing. And I think now for, if my memory serves, there have been well over 1,000 embryo adoptions in the United States, probably closer to 2,000 if you factored in multiple agencies that participate in services like this.
Were you skeptical about embryo adoption? And as a prospective dad, are there any recommendations you would give for prospective dads to overcome these barriers?
Sure. So that's a really good question. I would say that from my perspective, I was definitely a skeptic. And I think part of that is just, just foolish masculine pride, frankly, and just thinking about, could I love a child that's adopted as much as I do a biological child? What does this say about me as a father? Is this the right thing to do for our family? And ultimately, as I visited with my wife, who has I'm very thankful. She has a PhD in science education. She has spent a lot of time studying conditions like endometriosis that prevent many women from conceiving children naturally. She was able to help open my eyes to the challenges that so many families face when it comes to fertility, and recognizing the pain that families that have these remaining embryos face, believing that those embryos are human beings who have the best, giving them the best chance at life. And so I became convicted and convinced that it was the right thing for our family to do, knowing full well that at the end of that process, we might not actually have a baby because there was no guarantee that those embryos would be viable after being thawed. And so we were so privileged to connect with our biological family and to really, develop a relationship with them even before the adoption took place. And it's been a tremendous gift to our family ever since. It's a great question. I would definitely encourage dads who are on the fence to really think seriously about it, because it is something that I was initially skeptical of, and I'm really glad I changed my mind.
You're listening to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard, along with Nassau Community College student Gina Peter. And today we're learning all about embryo adoption with our guest, Nate Birt, author of Frozen, But Not Forgotten, an adoptive dad's step-by-step guide to embryo adoption, and someone that has adopted an embryo and successfully now has a child as a result of it. So I'm just curious, were you able to meet the parents of this embryo before making the decision for the adoption?
We didn't meet in person before the embryo adoption. Of course, this was pre-COVID, so we certainly could have. But the process that our adoption agency prescribed, which I think is exactly right, was that we actually, as my wife and I and our biological sons, prepared a portfolio of family photos, both our immediate family as well as extended family, grandparents, and pets and things of that nature. And our family actually has a few backyard chickens, so we included some photos of the chickens with the boys.
Oh, cool.
And it's really funny because one of the things after we brought our baby into the world and we did meet in person with the family, her biological family, which also shared photos and family history and I think 3 generations of medical history. So even though we hadn't met them, we knew a lot about them. And one of the things they told us the first time they met their biological child, our adopted child, they said, that photo of your youngest son trying to lick a chicken was what convinced us our own biological kids, and we felt like your family would be a great fit for us. We were really glad that even though we hadn't met in person, those photos really spoke 1,000 words.
And do you embrace the relationship now? How is the relationship between the parents of the embryo, if you will? Is that what you refer to them as?
Yeah, great question. So, Dr. Jeanine, we refer to them as our placing family.
Okay.
It's funny. They actually they have 3 biological children of their own, 2 daughters and a son. and their biological daughter said, Phoebe, who's our adopted daughter, is my friendster, right? She's both a friend, but she's also my sister. And I think that's, for kids, that's a great way to put it. For us, our relationship with our placing family is strong. Ironically, they actually live within a 2-hour drive of us, which in many cases for adopting families, they are separated by states. And so we've had the opportunity to get together for meals, pre-pandemic, and we're looking forward to doing that again in the future. Letting them see our daughter Phoebe grow up, sharing photos. Our adoption is open, and we chose that because we really wanted her, as she grows up, to have the confidence to be able to ask questions, to have a relationship to the degree that she wants to. And frankly, it's been really great because when we have a medical question or an allergy or something like that, we can reach out and say, hey, did you experience this with your own children? And, I realize everyone has a different level of comfort, but the research really suggests that to whatever degree you can allow openness to be possible, to the degree that it's safe and practical, it really is a gift to your child because it gives them a sense of who they are and where they come from and access in a way that historically adoptions didn't always allow. And so it's been that's something that we've really cherished as part of this process.
When you say open adoption, that means communication with their biological family. Can you tell me more about what that means exactly?
Yeah, so really what that means for our family, and obviously for every family it's a bit different, it means periodically getting together in person to spend time with our placing family so our adopted daughter can spend time with her biological family. For us, it also means sending periodic text messages, sending photos of our daughter as she's out doing activities, or, comparing her baby photos to her biological siblings' photos and seeing how similar or different they are. And so, it's really those simple things. It's not necessarily lots of intensive writing letters back and forth all the time, but it's sharing Christmas cards. It's having conversation. It's making sure that family feels connected, because they really did make a tremendous, a very emotional, a very spiritual, a very, again, all of these decisions that went into placing their embryos for adoption. And so we really feel both a responsibility and a privilege to be able to maintain that contact and make sure they're able to see our daughter growing up over time.
So it's very interesting, the whole notion of adopting an embryo. And I'm going to ask you a question that may be personal and spiritual at the same time. But when do you think life begins? Do you think it begins with the embryo, or for you, it was a decision that was, I'm sure you thought about it, but when do you think the life really began when it came down to this whole process of adoption and the embryo itself?
Absolutely. No, it's a really great question. And so from my perspective, as a Christian, the Bible teaches that life begins really at conception. And so that's what I personally believe. And I believe that that's what my faith teaches, what the Bible teaches. There's been, even within Christendom, there is conversation around this concept of ensoulment, some people call it. Do the soul and the body combine as once the baby is born into the world? Is it sometime before that? And so my perspective is that life begins at conception. And the way I explain it to people, and I realize there are differences of opinion, but I from my perspective, you and I would not be here if we had not started as an embryo. And so to me, you don't get to life, whether it's a baby, whether it's an adult, whether it's a senior, without that really foundational stage of the embryo. And so for me, that really changed the way I thought about this entire process, recognizing that, again, there's no guarantee that a baby is going to come from the thawing of a frozen embryo. But nonetheless, there are human beings with the potential to change the course of science, change the course of our economy, create opportunities for people who have historically been left out or who have been marginalized. And so when I think about all of those little people who have the opportunity to change our society for the better, it really led me to believe that we were doing the right thing. We're not heroes. We're not, we don't deserve a pat on the back. But what we do have a responsibility to do is to let other families know that this is yet another option for building a family. And these are people who have souls, who have talents, who have unique opportunities to change the course of our society for the better. And so for me, that's what I believe about the beginning of life. And that's why I feel so strongly about embryo adoption.
You're listening to Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC. My name is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard, along with Nassau Community College student Gina Peter. And today we're learning all about embryo adoption with our guest, Nate Birt, author of Frozen But Not Forgotten, an adoptive dad's step-by-step guide to embryo adoption, and someone that has adopted an embryo and successfully now has a child as a result of it. So just a question, how long are these embryos kept in a frozen state? And how are they discarded, if at all?
Yeah, that really great question, Dr. Jeanine. So, it really depends on the situation. In general, embryos are kept in frozen storage for years to decades. And so typically what happens, as I understand it, I've never been, I don't profess to have walked in the shoes of families who've been through infertility because that has not been my personal experience. But what I've read and what I've been told is that frozen embryos can remain in storage, again, through that sort of period of time from years to decades. It depends on, again, that family's personal preferences and their choices for how those embryos are to be treated. Again, in some cases, embryos are, families decide they want to donate those embryos to research. In some cases, they can choose to discard the embryos. In other cases, like what we've experienced with the family from whom we adopted, they chose to place them in storage and pay a fee. And one of the stories that might resonate with your audience, Dr. Jeanine, is that our placing mom told us that, for years, nearly a decade, this family had sort of wrestled with what to do with these embryos. Their family was complete, but they also, like us, believe that life begins at conception, and they believe that these embryos deserve the best chance at life. But she told us that whenever she would pick up the phone to call the adoption agency to have a consultation about what this process might look like, she would, break down in tears because it was such something that was weighing on her so heavily and such a challenging decision. And so, again, those are sort of the options. There's scientific research, there's discarding, there's placing in frozen storage, and ultimately after frozen storage, there's the chance to place for adoption. But many, many families have a really hard time taking that next step toward adoption. And so they just keep paying that retainer fee to ensure that those embryos are kept safe in storage. If you go on the news, you'll see that there have been cases that I can only imagine must have been horrible for families where those storage systems have failed. And so, those embryos are lost through no one's fault, simply because either the machines failed or the electricity went out or something like that. And so for many families, there's both a sense of urgency, but also a sense of being trapped between these decisions and not knowing what's best and really having a difficult time deciding that, what do I do now? And so most families decide, we're just going to wait another year. We're going to keep thinking about it. And it's just deferring that decision, not placing any blame on them whatsoever. I can only imagine what a difficult decision that is, but that's the reality.
In your book, Frozen But Not Forgotten, who should be reading this book? What kind of information do you include in it? And what does it tell you? Does it tell you if embryo adoption is right for you or not right for you? Can you tell me more?
Sure. Thanks for the question, Gina. So what I would say is that Frozen But Not Forgotten is a book that's written for anyone who is the least bit curious about embryo adoption. What is it? How did it get here? Why are there so many frozen embryos? And both from the perspective of a placing family, I've been through IVF and I have embryos I don't know what to do with, or from the perspective of couples who are looking to build their family. Or even for those who are, in ministry, or those who are advising, families on, family planning issues. It's really meant for all of those people. Ultimately, it's the book I wish my wife and I had as we were navigating this process, from the decision to decide to pursue adoption, all the way through to, carrying the baby, bringing it to term, building a relationship with your placing family afterwards. So it's really a step-by-step guide. Each chapter ends with a series of questions you can ask yourself, you can talk with your spouse about, you can ask your doctor. So, and it also includes some of the more difficult things. How do you talk to family or friends about this decision? How do you get over the factor that many people think it's weird or strange that you're doing this in the first place? And then how do you make sure that you talk with your kids and socialize this so, your adopted child truly becomes one of your children and they're not isolated or marginalized because of your decision to pursue embryo adoption?
Where can we find your book?
Sure. So you can find the book in a couple of places. It's available from any bookseller, Amazon, Barnes & Noble, etc. You can also go to frozenbutnotforgotten.com. Again, that's frozenbutnotforgotten.com and purchase the book directly from me. I would love to send you a copy, or you can even send me a note. I would love to answer any questions that your audience might have about embryo adoption.
How old is your daughter now?
So my daughter is going to be turning 3 in March. She is extremely precocious. She has a beautiful head of bright red hair.
Wow.
All of our family has brown hair. And so she is talking. Her favorite book right now is Go Dog Go. And we think she's going places.
So if you had to leave a departing comment or message to the listening audience, what would it be?
Thanks for the opportunity, Dr. Jeanine. I think I would say in closing, recognize that we are sort of at a moment in our history as a country where there is a lot of turmoil and challenge. But I want to encourage everyone out there, whether you have kids or not, whether you're single or married, whether whatever stage of life you're at, that the best hope for our future as a country, as a people, as a society is our children. And embryo adoption is something that my family and I have discovered changed our life. It's transformative. But I want people to think about embryo adoption, to be aware of it as an option, and just to recognize that whatever you do to improve the life of children, whether that's adopting, fostering, babysitting for your neighbors, whatever it might be, these kiddos have so much promise and potential. And so as a society, I just want to encourage us to do what we can to take care of families, take care of these kids, and just be a good example and look for opportunities to make their future brighter. I hope embryo adoption can be that option for many families. And I really hope that all of us recognize and appreciate all of those who are taking care of our kiddos, from our doctors to our teachers, and so many others, and just really uphold them and encourage them as this year and as our lives continue. Because, again, despite all the challenges we're facing today, there's so much potential for the future.
Well, thank you so much for being here. Very interested, Nate Birt, author of Frozen But Not Forgotten, for telling us all about your personal journey with embryo adoption. We hope you and your family stay safe and continue to do the great work. And thank you so much for being our guest today.
Well, Dr. Jeanine, Gina, thank you so much. And thank you to all your listeners. Have a great day and take good care.
This is Dr. Jeanine Cook-Garard from the nursing department here at Nassau Community College, along with student Gina Peter. And we want to thank you for listening to this week's edition of Your Family's Health.
We'd like to get your feedback on your family's health. Send your comments by emailing them to whpc@ncc.edu. Podcasts of today's show are available on iTunes, Android Podcasts, and Spreaker. This program was produced at the studios of Nassau Community College in cooperation with the nursing department. Join us next week for another edition of Your Family's Health on the voice of Nassau Community College, 90.3 WHPC.